I still remember what happened last night. The Apache woman said to the cowboy who saved her. Dawn crept over Lost Ember Valley in a pale, breathless shimmer when Chief suddenly bolted, paws tearing through cold dust. The black-mouthed cur barked once, sharp and urgent, before weaving through the mesquite shadows as if pulled by something unseen. Frankie Cooper followed with a hand near his holster, boots striking the hard earth. Then he saw her. A young Apache woman lay collapsed across the sand, her dark hair fanned like spilled ink, catching the faint silver of morning light, even beneath blood and dust. Her beauty was unmistakable: high cheekbones, strong jawline, lashes long enough to brush her cheeks, a quiet fierceness carved into the stillness of her face. The torn hide dress revealed elegant lines of muscle shaped by a life in the wild. She looked both fragile and untamed, like a wildflower crushed under a wagon wheel, yet refusing to wilt. Chief stood guard over her, rigid and snarling at the empty valley as though defending someone precious. Frankie dropped to one knee, felt the faint tremor of breath beneath her ribs, and lifted her into his arms. Chief followed close, refusing to leave her side. Inside the cabin's warm glow, she stirred at last. Her eyes opened dark, luminous, haunted, and when they locked on to Frankie, her voice cracked in a whisper that froze him where he stood. I still remember what happened last night. Lost Ember Valley woke slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to disturb its silence. The land stretched wide and hollow, carved from red stone and wind, a place where a man could disappear without leaving so much as a whispered memory behind. Morning light spilled over the ridge and into Frankie Cooper's cabin, a squat, weathered structure built from cedar logs and years of solitude. Smoke from the stove mingled with the mineral scent of damp stone, filling the single room with a quiet warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold, unforgiving valley outside. Frankie moved through the space with the ease of someone who had lived too long without company. His shoulders carried the shape of a man once built for authority broad, disciplined, confident now, wrapped in a stillness that bordered on haunted. A faint scar traced along his jaw, and his eyes, sharp and gray as river slate, seemed to watch everything while revealing nothing. He set aside his rifle, its metal worn from use rather than decoration, then glanced toward the cot near the fire. She was awake now barely. The Apache woman he had carried in at dawn lay half upright against a folded blanket, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders in soft waves that caught every flicker of firelight. Beneath the dried blood and torn hide, her beauty was undeniable, a face sculpted with bold symmetry, cheekbones like carved stone, lips full but pressed tight from pain. Her eyes dark, deep, and fiercely alive followed every movement he made. Even injured, she held herself with a quiet dignity, like a mountain cat forced into stillness but never broken. Frankie poured water from the clay jug into a tin cup, and the faint scrape of metal made her flinch. She tried to mask it, but he saw. He saw everything. "You're safe," he said, voice low, roughened more by disuse than distrust. She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze drifted slowly across the room, absorbing her surroundings with the instinct of someone who'd survived by noticing things others overlooked. The cabin was sparse: just a cot, a single table, a chair pulled close to the hearth, and weaponry hung neat along one wall. Practical, efficient, lifeless. Nothing soft remained here except the faint trace of a woman's shawl folded carefully on a shelf, its edges worn to threads. Her eyes lingered on that shawl, flickering with curiosity. Frankie looked away. Chief lay curled at the foot of her cot, head lifted, amber eyes watching her with unwavering loyalty. The dog had chosen her long before Frankie understood why. Every time she shifted, Chief's ears twitched. When she winced, he nudged her hand with his muzzle. She seemed surprised by his concern, even unsure what to do with it. "What is this place?" she asked finally, her voice thin from blood loss. "Lost Ember Valley," Frankie said. "My cabin sits where most folks don't bother coming." Most she pressed. His jaw tightened. All. A silence settled, fragile but somehow grounding. Shada's gaze drifted to Frankie's hands as he lifted the cup toward her. They were strong hands, calloused from work, but gentle enough not to startle her. She accepted the water, though her grip trembled. Frankie steadied the cup without touching her skin. Her breath eased after a few sips. A flush of warmth returned to her cheeks, softening the harshness carved by exhaustion. "What's your name?" Frankie asked. She hesitated, weighing him, weighing the meaning of names. Then, softly, she answered, "Shada." He nodded once. "Frankie." Though she had spoken only a single word, something subtle shifted. The distance between them, vast and mistrustful, narrowed slightly, like the first crack in a canyon wall that lets a sliver of sunlight through. And yet, beneath that fragile quiet, both carried secrets heavy enough to anchor the valley itself. Shada clutched the blanket closer, eyes flickering with memories she refused to release. Frankie turned back to the fire, hiding the shadow crossing his own face. Neither of them knew it yet. But this valley, once a refuge for ghosts, would soon become the place where two wounded lives collided, reshaped, and began to breathe again. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, sending shifting light across the cabin walls and drawing crooked shadows around them. Outside, the valley held its breath, the stillness so complete it felt as though the world itself were listening. Shada tried to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement tugged at the wound in her shoulder. Frankie stepped forward out of instinct, but Chief lifted his head sharply, watching him with the same protective vigilance he had shown since dawn. Frankie paused, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "I'm just going to move the blanket," he said. Shada's fingers tightened around the edge of the wool, and her gaze sharpened, suspicious, alive, assessing. She didn't speak, but she didn't stop him either. Chief relaxed only when Frankie retucked the fabric gently across her chest, careful to avoid the injury. "You found me," she murmured, eyes drifting to Chief before returning to Frankie. "Or he did." "Chief doesn't bring strangers home," Frankie replied. "Not ever." Shada let her gaze rest on the dog. Something softened in her expression. Almost imperceptibly, a flicker of gratitude for a creature she did not yet understand. Frankie stayed standing for a moment, unsure what shift had taken place inside the small room. He'd treated wounded outlaws before, seen bandits and drifters bleed out on saloon floors. But this was different. Shada wasn't asking for help. She was measuring whether she could survive without it. He cleared his throat. "You lost a lot of blood. You'll need rest." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I will not be here long." He studied her, the tension in her jaw, the stubborn set of her shoulders despite the pain. She was planning to run, he could see it plain as day. But she was in no condition to travel, and she knew it. "Then at least wait until you can stand," Frankie said. A gust of wind rattled the window shutter, and Shada flinched again. Not from sound, Frankie realized, but from memory. Something in the way she scanned the room. The door, the single window, told him she was expecting danger to follow. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. Her eyes froze. A wall slammed down behind them, a refusal, or perhaps a fear too jagged to speak aloud. She turned her face away, hiding the storm brewing in her silence. "You don't have to tell me," he added. Shada's breath trembled once before steadying. She looked back at him, and this time their eyes met fully. Suspicion remained, but beneath it lay exhaustion and something else. A fragile, reluctant trust born not from comfort but from necessity. Chief's tail thumped once on the floor, as if sensing the shift. Frankie sat on the edge of the table, giving her space yet refusing to retreat completely. He wasn't used to company, neither was she. But the valley, the firelight, the dog, the wound their circumstances bound them closer than either wanted to admit. "You live alone?" she asked. "For a long time," he answered. By choice, Frankie looked at the rifle on the wall, then the shawl folded neatly on the shelf. Shadows moved across his features, darkening them. "Sometimes choice isn't the same as wanting," he said. Shada watched him carefully, as though she recognized the weight of grief when she saw it. Her hand lifted unconsciously to her own shoulder, to the pain that had not yet found words. Neither pressed further. They sat in the quiet glow of the fire, two strangers joined by wounds that had yet to be named. Outside, Lost Ember Valley settled deeper into morning stillness, unaware that its solitude had been broken first by a wounded woman, then by the man who saved her, and now by the silent recognition passing between them. The valley had seen many things, but it had never watched two ghosts begin to see each other again. The hours in Frankie Cooper's cabin passed in slow, cautious breaths. Shada healed in fragments each day, a careful negotiation between strength and pain, while the valley outside drifted through wind-scoured afternoons and star-poured nights. Inside, something quieter took shape, not comfort, not yet trust, but the beginning of a fragile belonging neither she nor Frankie had expected to feel again. Frankie tended her wound every morning with steady, disciplined hands. His touch was precise and light, as though he feared his fingers might break something in her. Shada watched him without speaking. He carried grief the way some men carried weapons, close, hidden, and always ready to surface. She recognized the weight of it, because she carried her own. Chief rarely left her side. When she shifted, he lifted his head. When she groaned, he nudged her hand with his warm muzzle. It startled her at first, this loyalty from a creature she had never met. But when she reached out and rested her fingers on his fur, Chief pressed into her palm with a soft sound. A wordless pact was made in that simple touch. On the fourth afternoon, she stepped outside. The wind combed through her hair, and the vastness of Lost Ember Valley opened around her raw, sun-scorched, endless. Frankie stood a few paces behind, arms crossed loosely, watching but not intruding. The moment might have lasted longer if Chief hadn't stiffened. Hackles lifting. A shape moved along the ridge, in a single motion. Frankie drew his revolver, stance widening. Shada's breath snagged. Chief growled low, a warning rolling through his chest. The man emerging down the slope looked carved from the same wild land, lean, swift, eyes burning with intent. Before Frankie could speak, the stranger drew an arrow and pulled his bowstring taut. Frankie leveled his revolver at him, the metal glinting under the sun. Shada gasped. Dasan. Her brother didn't lower the bow. His gaze locked onto Frankie with lethal precision, protective fury radiating from every line of his body. Chief moved between them, teeth bared. Frankie shifted his stance, ready to fire. Shada stumbled forward, throwing herself between them. Stop. For an agonizing moment, neither man moved. Finally, Dasan lowered his bow, jaw clenched tight. Frankie holstered his revolver slowly, though the tension in him remained sharp as flint. Chief relaxed only when both weapons were down, though one eye stayed fixed on Dasan. Inside the cabin, the air remained taut as a drawn wire. Dasan paced once before speaking. "We saw them," he began, voice low and steady. "That night, we were returning from the hunt. The moon was thin. The desert was quiet. Too quiet." Shada swallowed, the memory pulling at the raw edges inside her. Dasan continued. "We heard a scream, one the wind couldn't hide. We crawled up the ridge and saw a wagon stopped on Mesa Trail Crossing. A merchant family, husband, wife, and a young daughter." His voice darkened. 4 men in black surrounded them. One kicked the father to the ground and tied his wrists. The mother tried to shield the girl, but they struck her down, bound her hands, and left both parents in the dust like they were nothing. Shada's eyes glistened, the horror returning. Frankie didn't move, but his jaw tightened. "They looted everything," Dasan said, pacing again. "Barrels, sacks, crates, whatever the merchants carried." One laughed as he tossed goods into the dirt. Another dragged the girl away. She screamed for her mother until her voice broke. Frankie's grip on the table edge whitened. Dasan's gaze shifted to Shada, pain twisting his features. "We watched without a sound. We had to. But when we tried to slip back into the dark..." He paused, swallowing hard. Shada stepped on a dry branch. Shada closed her eyes as if feeling the gunshot again. All 4 turned toward us. Dasan said, but the one with the rifle, he reacted first. Tall, broad, hat low, and only one eye. The left side of his face was ruined. He lifted his rifle and fired before I could pull her away. Shada's hand went to her shoulder unconsciously. The bullet hit her. We ran, but we lost each other in the dark. Silence fell heavy. Frankie lowered himself onto the edge of the table, eyes wide but distant, as if pulled backward through memories he had buried deep. "A man with one eye," he murmured, "tall, carries a rifle." "Yes," Dasan said. "Do you know him?" Frankie looked up. Something hollow and brutal flickered across his face. "Maddox Crowder," he whispered. "One-eyed Maddox." Dasan paused. "Then you have faced him." Frankie nodded once, a gesture slow and weighted. "I arrested him 2 years ago. He fought hard. I shot him, took his eye. After I put him in irons, his men came for revenge. His breath thinned, fists curling. Reese, Riker, Quinn." Shada leaned forward, feeling the tremor beneath his words. "They couldn't reach me," Frankie said, voice cracking. "So they reached her." Shada understood instantly. The shawl, the silence, the grief. "My wife," Frankie said. "She never saw them coming." Chief whined softly, pressing against Frankie's leg. Dasan lowered his head with the solemn understanding of a man who had seen too much death. "And now they are together again," Frankie said. "Freed, hunting, killing. And they shot you because you saw them." Shada lifted her chin. "They won't stop." Frankie met her gaze haunted, resolute. "No," he said, "they won't." Dasan stepped closer. "Then we hunt them before they find this place." Shada nodded, fire returning to her eyes. Frankie rose, revolver at his hip, grief sharpening into purpose. Chief barked once, as if sealing their pact. In that moment, the 3 of them, Apache hunter, wounded Apache's woman, Broken bounty hunters stood bound not by chance, but by a purpose forged in blood. Their hunt had begun. Black Vulture Canyon narrowed into a twisting throat of stone as Frankie, Shada, Dasan, and Chief approached the heart of the outlaws' hideout. Wind scraped along the cliffs, carrying faint smoke and voices, confirmation they were close. Frankie raised a hand, signaling them lower. The group crouched behind a jagged ridge. Below, 4 men moved around a dying campfire. Quinn leaned against a rock, sharpening his knife. Riker limped in circles, muttering as he checked ammunition. Reese kicked angrily at crates from the looted merchant wagon. And Maddox's one-eyed Crowder stood apart, drinking from a battered tin, the firelight reflecting off his eye patch like a cold coin. But it was the small bundle tied beside one of the crates that drew Shada's breath into a sharp gasp. A little girl no more than 8 huddled beneath a thin, dusty blanket. Her hands were bound at the wrists. Tear tracks streaked her cheeks. She trembled each time one of the outlaws spoke too loudly. Shada pressed a hand to her chest, remembering the child's scream when she and Dasan watched from the shadows that night. She could almost feel that helpless terror all over again. "We get her out first," Frankie whispered. Dasan nodded. "We strike when they break formation." They waited. Minutes dragged by like hours. Finally, Reese wandered behind a boulder to relieve himself. Dasan drew an arrow silently, exhaled, and let it fly. The arrow struck deep into Reese's calf, and he collapsed with a strangled cry, clutching his leg as he fell hard into the sand. Frankie's eyes hardened. "Go." Everything sprang into motion. Dasan circled left, bow raised. Frankie and Chief moved right, taking the shadows. Shada stayed behind the ridge, rifle ready, her eyes fixed on the little girl. Quinn spotted movement and surged forward. Before he could shout, Chief launched himself out of the dark, teeth clamping into Quinn's forearm. The knife clattered onto stone. Frankie rushed in, striking Quinn with the butt of his revolver. The outlaw crumpled. Riker grabbed his shotgun, blasting blindly toward the rock face. Frankie rolled away as pellets exploded in a shower of stone shards. He fired twice, one bullet taking Riker's leg out from under him, the second sending the shotgun spinning out of reach. Shada, heart pounding, crawled toward the girl. She whispered softly, "I'm here. I won't let them hurt you." The child looked up with wide, terrified eyes. "Please, take me home." Shada severed the bindings with Quinn's dropped knife. The girl collapsed into her arms. Trembling so hard, Shada felt it through her own ribs. She lifted the child onto her hip, ready to run, but then Maddox turned. The outlaw leader saw Shada, saw the girl in her arms, and a spark of murderous recognition lit his remaining eye. "You," he snarled. "The Apache that saw too much." He snatched his long rifle, raising it toward Shada. Frankie stepped out to draw fire, and Maddox fired first. The bullet struck Frankie's thigh. He staggered back, nearly collapsing, a cry escaping through clenched teeth. Shada gasped as he hit the ground. Maddox swung the rifle toward her again. "Drop the girl," he barked, "or I'll kill you both." The little girl clung to Shada's neck, sobbing. Shada's breath shook, but she held her tighter, turning her body to shield the child. Maddox aimed down the sights cold, steady, merciless. And then Chief moved. The dog flew like lightning, teeth sinking deep into Maddox's forearm just as he pulled the trigger. The rifle jerked skyward. The shot cracked harmlessly into the canyon wall. Maddox howled in pain, staggering under Chief's weight. Chief Shada cried. The dog held on fiercely, ripping until Maddox stumbled to one knee. Frankie pushed himself up, despite the blood pouring from his leg. His face twisted, not from pain, but from something deeper, something righteous and furious. The grief he carried for 2 years ignited into something sharp and unstoppable. He moved toward Maddox with the deadly calm of a man who had nothing left to lose. Maddox saw him coming. Fear broke across his face. Frankie leveled his revolver at him, stance unwavering even as his injured leg trembled. This time, Frankie growled, voice low as a storm, "I won't miss." Maddox's bravado shattered. He dropped his rifle, raising his hands. "Wait, Cooper, don't shoot. I surrender. Don't kill me." Frankie held his aim for a long, punishing moment before finally lowering the gun. Not because Maddox deserved mercy, but because Shada and the trembling child were watching. Chief released Maddox, but stood guard, growling as the man whimpered and clutched his bleeding arm. Riker writhed on the ground. Quinn remained unconscious. Reese lay behind the boulder. The fight was done. Shada carried the girl to Frankie. The child sobbed into the Apache woman's shoulder, whispering, "Thank you, thank you." Frankie looked up at Shada, breathing ragged. "You saved her," he said. Shada shook her head. "You saved us." Frankie tried to stand but crumpled, the pain finally overwhelming him. Shada lowered the girl carefully, then caught Frankie as his weight sagged into her arms. Her face hovered inches from his, breath trembling. "You're hurt," she whispered. Frankie tried to smile, but his voice barely came out. "Worth it." Dasan secured the prisoners, tying their hands and feet. The little girl stayed glued to Shada's side, gripping her fingers with desperate trust. By sundown, they were on the road back to Rusted Spur Town. Frankie slung over Dasan's shoulder. The child nestled safely in front of Shada, and Chief circling them like a guardian spirit. The journey back to Rusted Spur Town was slow, grueling, and heavy with exhaustion, but also with something brighter, a fragile sense of justice having finally taken root. Frankie rode, slumped in the saddle, pain slicing through his wounded leg, while Shada supported him from the side to keep him steady. Dasan led the captured outlaws Maddox. Riker, Reese, and Quinn bound and tied to their horses. Chief circled them tirelessly, guarding the group as fiercely as he had in the canyon. Cradled in Shada's arms, the rescued merchant girl clung to her with trembling trust. Her small fingers dug into the Apache woman's shoulder, but Shada only held her closer, whispering soft reassurances in her native tongue. When the weary group reached the outskirts of Rusted Spur Town, people gathered quickly, murmuring in disbelief. Word spread like wildfire. Ghost of the Wild West had returned, and he hadn't come back alone. The sheriff and 2 deputies rushed forward to take custody of the prisoners. Maddox didn't speak, his arrogance gone, replaced with fear and the dull shock of defeat. Riker limped as they dragged him off, and Quinn's bruised face hung low as ropes tightened around his wrists. But the town's attention shifted when a shout rose from the far end of the street. "My baby, my baby." A woman sprinted toward them, her husband stumbling behind her. Their tear-streaked faces were instantly recognizable, the merchant couple who had been found days earlier, tied and abandoned on the dusty trail. When they caught sight of their daughter in Shada's arms, they collapsed to their knees in overwhelming relief. The little girl let out a sob. Mama Shada gently lowered her into her mother's embrace. The woman clutched her child, crying so hard her shoulders shook. The father wrapped his arms around both of them, his face twisted with gratitude and disbelief. "Bless you," he whispered, voice breaking as he looked up at Frankie. "You brought her back. You," he choked on the words, "Ghost of the West. God bless you." Frankie tried to speak, to say something modest, but his body swayed. The pain in his leg flared white-hot, and his vision blurred. Shada caught him before he fell, her arms locking around his torso. "We need to get him inside," she said urgently. The townsfolk parted instantly, watching with awe and curiosity as Shada and Dasan supported Frankie into the sheriff's office. Inside, Frankie sank onto a cot, sweat beading along his brow. Shada remained glued to his side, wiping dirt and blood from his skin. Unraveling the bandage with careful fingers, Chief lay at Frankie's feet, refusing to be moved. The town doctor arrived, but he paused when he saw Shada already cleaning the wound. "You know what you're doing," he said gently. "I'll assist." Together, they stitched Frankie's leg. He clenched his jaw, but didn't cry out once. Shada held his wrist through the worst of it, her thumb brushing small circles into his skin, steady, grounding, unspoken comfort. When it was done, Dasan stepped forward. His face was calm, but his eyes held the knowledge that the moment he'd been dreading had arrived. "I must return to Whispering Dune encampment," he said quietly. "Our people will need to hear what happened. They will want to know Shada is alive." Shada inhaled, torn. Dasan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You have walked your road with courage, little sister. Now follow where your spirit leads." Shada looked to Frankie, pale, exhausted, but alive. His breath steadied when she came near. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't dare. But his eyes held a question deeper than words. She turned back to Dasan and nodded softly. "I will visit when I can." Dasan embraced her briefly, pride and sorrow threading through his voice. "Walk strong, Shada." He nodded to Frankie with newfound respect. Then he left, disappearing into the valley with the quiet stride of a seasoned hunter. Shada watched him go before turning back to Frankie. "I'll take him home," she said, not to the doctor, nor to the sheriff, but to the valley itself. "He needs rest, and someone to watch over him." Frankie managed a weak smile. "You sure about that?" Shada lifted his arm over her shoulders, steadying him. "I'm sure," Chief barked once as if sealing the decision. The ride back to Lost Ember Valley was slow. The sun dipped behind the cliffs as they reached the cabin, this time not as strangers, not as wounded survivors, but as two souls who had fought side by side and chosen not to walk away. Shada settled Frankie onto the bed, lit the fire, and began preparing water to clean his bandages. He watched her move through the space, confident, calm, already belonging in a place that had once held only ghosts. When she knelt beside him, brushing hair from his brow, Frankie whispered, "You didn't have to come." Shada met his gaze, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I came because I wanted to." And for the first time in years, Frankie Cooper let himself breathe without the weight of grief crushing him. Lost Ember Valley greeted them with a soft, fading glow, as though the land itself recognized their return. The sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long amber shadows across the cabin and painting the cedar walls in warm gold. Frankie leaned against Shada for support as she helped him down from the saddle. Chief bounded ahead, circling the doorway as if welcoming them home. Inside, the fire crackled to life under Shada's careful hands. She moved through the small cabin with quiet confidence, fetching blankets, preparing water, arranging supplies, her presence slipping naturally into the spaces Frankie had once kept empty. It struck him how seamless it felt, how the room seemed different simply because she was in it. Frankie lay back on the cot with a heavy breath. Pain throbbed in his leg, but it was gentler now, softened by exhaustion and the warmth spreading through the room. Shada knelt beside him, her fingers brushing over the fresh bandage. Her touch was steady, reassuring, so different from the frantic fear of the canyon. "You should be resting too," Frankie murmured. Shada shook her head. "You walk into gunfire for people. Someone has to make sure you don't fall apart afterward." He huffed a quiet laugh, the sound breaking into a wince. "I'm not used to someone staying, and I'm not used to someone fighting for me," she replied softly. Frankie met her gaze. Her eyes reflected the firelight, holding both the strength of a survivor and a tenderness she rarely showed. In that fragile glow, he saw not only the woman he rescued, but the woman who had rescued him right back. Chief sprawled at Frankie's feet, already asleep, tail twitching as though guarding them in dreams. Shada smiled faintly at the sight before turning back to Frankie. "Sleep," she said. "I'll be here." He swallowed, something tight loosening in his chest. "Shada, do you really intend to stay, after everything?" Her answer was not rushed. She looked around the cabin, the place that witnessed his loneliness, his grief, and now his healing. Then she reached for his hand, threading her fingers lightly through his. "I chose this path," she whispered. "I chose you. Not because I owe you anything, but because my heart rests here." Frankie breathed out slowly, almost shakily. "Then stay as long as you want." Shada leaned her forehead toward his, her voice barely above a breath. "I intend to. Outside." Dusk settled into night. The valley that once hid a broken man now held something new, a flicker of hope, rising gently within the wooden walls of the cabin, warming the space the way morning light did over the desert stone, and for the first time in a very long time. Frankie Cooper fell asleep not as ghost of the Wild West, but as a man no longer alone.